right, let's go ahead and start. Anybody have any questions about paper number 3? So if you have not already turned in the first part of paper number 3, you should be talking to me. Those we're currently grading, we'll get them back to you as soon as we can. I wrote on the handout that if you're, the longer version of it's not due for a while, but if you're anxious for moving forward on that and getting feedback from us, just come see one of us during office hours and let us know ahead of time that you are coming. And if we are able, depends how much notice you give us, right? But if we are able, we will put your paper on the top of the stack and we'll try to read it before you come to see us, and we can get you some feedback quicker that way. Otherwise, we'll just get it to you as soon as we get through the full stack. Questions about the paper? Thank you. So, I don't know how easy that is to see. We've talked about North Carolina's electoral districts a couple times this semester. I was just looking for the same map that I've showed you before, but I couldn't find it. But I just found this moving one, which is showing you, it's a little bit hard to follow as it moves, but it is showing you, this is the current district map in North Carolina, and so you've got like these like long, crazy, skinny ones and stuff like that. And it has been alleged, and in fact has been proven in court, in the lower court, that the North Carolina legislature drew the existing district lines with the intentional and explicit goal of making it easier for Republicans to win more of the seats. Right? Democrats have done this too. This was Republicans in this instance. State legislature, after the 2010 election, was controlled by Republicans. After the 2010 census, the state had to redraw its congressional districts. And there's substantial evidence that the main thing they were trying to do is figure out as many Republican seats as they could. And in fact, there was a quote from like one of the Republican legislative leaders saying, I forget the numbers, is there like 12 seats and 13 seats and 10 of them are Republican held at the moment, something like that. And he's like, yeah, the only reason it's not 11 and 2 is we couldn't figure out how to draw the map that way. We did the best we could to guarantee 10 Republican seats. So this is an issue, not this case, not North Carolina, but this is an issue that is at the Supreme Court right now. Right? Last fall, the Supreme Court heard arguments in a case from Wisconsin, where again there is very strong evidence that a Republican-controlled state legislature redrew the districts with the goal of helping Republicans win as many seats as possible. Then this was a little bit unusual. So the court heard arguments, I think that was in October, in that case, Gill versus Whitford, and then a couple months went by, and the court agreed to hear another case on the same issue, which is a little weird. The court sometimes takes multiple cases on the same issue at the same time, and they say, oh, there's kind of different arguments and different evidence in these 2 or 3 different cases, so we'll kind of combine them together and hear them all at once. Like the court heard 2 different cases about affirmative action from the University of Michigan at the same time, right? So the court does that sometimes, but that's not what they did here. They heard one case, and they heard arguments, and they were in the process of deciding it, and then they added another case. And usually what they do, if they already have a case that is proceeding, and there's other cases that come along that are about basically the same thing, they just put them on hold. They just say, hold off, that case is paused, we're going to decide something important about this issue in this other case, and after we do that, we'll figure out what to do with the other ones. But that's not what they did. They agreed to hear the second case. The second case, which they heard arguments in yesterday, is, I forget what it's called. It's from Maryland. It is called Benesac versus Lamone. And the speculation, and in Maryland, the legislature is controlled by Democrats. And so in this instance, Democrats had drawn some funny-shaped districts, purportedly with the goal of helping Democrats win more seats. And so, and the districts were challenged in court by Republicans, so it's the opposite politically, right? And so the speculation was that, well, if the court is going to rule against partisan gerrymandering, it will be, what adjective do I want? It would be nice. It would be valuable to do it simultaneously in two cases, one of which is the Republicans who are doing the objectionable gerrymandering and the other was the Democrats doing the objectionable gerrymandering, and it helps the court maintain some pretense of balance, right? We're not striking down something that just Republicans do. We're striking down something that both parties do. Look, at the same time, on the same day, we're going to decide both these cases and rule against both parties. We think this violates the Constitution no matter who's doing it. So that was the speculation when they agreed to hear this case. And then they heard arguments yesterday, and so you can read, there's a number of press accounts of the arguments yesterday. There's still no real clear indication of what the court's going to do. And in fact, the tea leaves, a lot of, at the oral arguments, right, the lawyers stand up here in front of the 9 justices who ask them questions. The lawyers don't even do that much talking. The justices are constantly interrupting with questions. And so people, the press who's in the room and other observers who are in the room, like to try to see what the justices are asking about and then try to predict. You have to predict what the court's going to do. To the extent that there were, I read 2 accounts, to the extent that there was any predictive content in any of those questions, it sounded like the court is not going to rule against partisan gerrymandering. Because the weird thing about doing it like this, where they heard arguments in one case in October and then hearing arguments in a second case on basically the exact same issue in March, is that they've already been working on that case from October ever since. Right? They have already voted in private and they know which way it's coming out and they are busily writing opinions in that case if they're following their ordinary procedures. So the 9 justices already know, unless somebody changes his mind or her mind over the coming weeks, they already know which way the Wisconsin case is going to come out. And Stephen Breyer, Clinton appointee, Democrat on the court, was asking questions, like floating different possibilities about what if, seems like we got these 2 cases here, but there's these other important cases. He mentioned the one from North Carolina that are raising further concerns about this issue that have been getting a lot of attention. And it seems like there's even more evidence that we could gather that would help us have an even fuller record. What if we decided to rehear these cases again next year with the North Carolina one added into the mix too, to give us an even fuller record? Why would Breyer suggest that if he thinks his side has already got a majority in the Wisconsin case? That is total rampant speculation. Nobody knows for sure, but that's the news from yesterday.
I just wanted to say I read it was also strange that the 2 cases were argued on different rationale, Wisconsin being the 14th Amendment and Maryland being the First
Amendment. Right. So that is one, legally, that is the cover story, I don't know. The official story for why the court added the second case is that it raises a slightly different legal argument, right? The main arguments in the case emphasize a different part of the Constitution, and either one of them could be relevant. The court doesn't really have to add another case to do that, because if they want to, they can address whatever part of the Constitution they want in the first case. It's better if the lawyers have fully addressed it and briefed it, and so maybe that's one reason why they added the second case for sure.
What is the First Amendment question?
This is slightly convoluted, but so the weird thing about the system that we have in most states, right? Electoral districts are drawn by the state legislature, which is obviously a partisan institution, even for federal elections, right? So we're talking about the state legislature, which is controlled by Democrats in Maryland, redrawing Maryland's congressional districts, most of which are held by Democrats, but not all of them. There's conservative parts of Maryland, and they got Republican members of Congress. And the allegation in this case is that they redrew one particular district. I mean, you can never just redraw one district, because if you move the lines of one, it changes the other ones too. But they particularly were targeting one particular district, which had a Republican incumbent who had, I don't even remember the specifics, he had supported some policy or said something that was particularly objectionable to the state leaders in Maryland of the other party. And so they were targeting him. They were intentionally redrawing his district, and it worked. He got voted out at the next election as like retaliation for because of their disagreement with some policies that he had advocated. And so he is arguing, that former Republican congressman and his supporters are arguing that violated the First Amendment. That is a less straightforward argument against partisan gerrymandering than the 14th Amendment argument, which emphasizes the Equal Protection Clause. But it's possible, it's plausible, and so they added it. The court's got to decide this case by June, so I want everyone to keep that in mind.
So what I don't understand, like, shouldn't
Not this case, Maryland.
Shouldn't partisan gerrymandering just be inherently something that the court should decide? I mean, like, it is representational. Like, I know they argue that it's not, that they're intervening if it's like racial, in terms of like racial cases, but
Yeah.
partisan gerrymandering is still lacking representation for a lot of voices.
So the court on multiple occasions has said that if a legislature draws districts, considers race as a key criterion in redrawing districts, they have said that is unconstitutional, but they have never to date said that it is unconstitutional for them to consider partisanship, right? So like they're using computer mapping software, right, to draw these maps. They have very detailed election data down to like the city block level, right? It shows how people are registered and how they voted and whatnot in different precincts. And so the legislatures have the capacity to tailor the districts really carefully to advance the prospects of their party winning more elections. And the court has never yet said that that's unconstitutional, and there is a lot of people weighing in, encouraging the court to say this year that it is unconstitutional, and the justices' questions and oral arguments in both cases, from both some liberal justices and some conservative justices, they have suggested that they think there are some really serious constitutional issues here. This is a problem that a lot of people are paying attention to. It seems dubious, right? Why would it be legitimate in a democratic system to let the current elected office holders draw the districts however they want to make it more likely that they can win more elections? That doesn't sound legitimate, right? But some of them are really reluctant to have the court weigh in and try to settle this issue. And that is part of what we're going to focus on today. Like, what are the two sides? Why is one side really reluctant to do that?
This might be a weird question, but just if you look at that, redrawn districts that way seem really complicated. And do they hire outside statisticians to come in and look at what the best layout would be, or are they?
Well, they hire people to come in, but whether their assignment is to come up with the best layout, it depends, right? Most states do this by just having their state legislatures in charge of it, right? So they hire staff, they have staff, and they have mapping experts and software experts and voting data experts to come in and help them work out the details. And in many states, at many points in time, the instructions to those staffers are to give us the best map to elect more Republicans or elect more Democrats, right? Some states have moved away from that. California, for example, has adopted a system where there is a nonpartisan redistricting commission, right? They are not part of the state legislature. They do not report to the state legislature. Some of their members are appointed by each party, but some of them are independent experts, right? It's supposed to be a nonpartisan commission. And they draw the districts, and there's substantial evidence that there's less gerrymander. The districts are not as weirdly shaped, right? They follow more natural boundaries, right? Natural geographic and natural political boundaries, right? All else equal, put a whole city in a single district. Don't chop the city up into a bunch of slices so that you walk across the street and you're in a different congressional district. Why? How does that help anybody with civic engagement? They don't even know what district they're in if you're constantly slicing it up like that, right? Nonpartisan experts, when given the power to draw districts, there is evidence that they do it differently, right? They also hire experts, but they give the experts different instructions. They say, we want districts that respect natural, political, and geographic boundaries, right? If there's a river here, let's use that as a boundary, right? Don't put a congressional district crossing over the lake or whatever if we don't have to. So it's about the instructions that they're given. And gerrymandering has existed forever, right? It's named after Elbridge Gerry, whose name was actually pronounced Gary. So supposedly we're supposed to all say gerrymandering. But he was a member of the Constitutional Convention in 1787 and also governor of Massachusetts, and was accused in a political cartoon of drawing unfair districts, and somebody drew a political cartoon showing the district shaped like a salamander with like his head on it, right? And they called it a gerrymander. That was a long time ago, right? And but they did not have this kind of mapping software back then, so they could do it, but they couldn't do it as effectively and precisely as they can now, right? And so the problem, by all accounts, both because of the technological developments and because of the heightened polarization of our political system currently, the problem, by all accounts, has gotten worse, right? Both parties have done it. All parties have done it at various points for a long time, but by all accounts, it has gotten worse. And at the moment, it has particularly gotten worse on the Republican side because in the 2010 elections, Republicans captured control of a whole bunch of state legislatures, right? More than they had ever had in recent memory. And 2010 was a census year, so that newly elected Republican legislatures had the power to redraw all these districts. So Maryland, it's a Democratic gerrymander, but in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and North Carolina and Ohio and Texas, there have been allegations of significant Republican gerrymanders since 2010, right? So keep this question in your minds for a second. The drawing of district lines, of course, is not the only question of electoral law that might raise some constitutional issues, right? We could think about other questions too. For example, how are votes cast and counted? Which one do I want here? Take a look at that. You can see it. Might get bigger if I look up. Is that bigger? Oh, there we go. This is the presidential election ballot used in Palm Beach County, Florida in November 2000. Palm Beach County, Florida, as with many Florida counties at the time, although not all of them, but many of Florida's most populous counties at the time used a punch card voting machine, which I have used them. They are, it's from the 1950s or something. It's like, well, this is how we are voted. You walk into the precinct, they hand you a little, it's not a piece of paper, it's like cardstock, right? It's like a rectangle, like index card thing, that has no names or words of any kind printed on it. It's got some like numbered rows with little perforated squares in it. And you find an empty voting booth, and you go to the voting booth, and you slide your card into this slot, and they give you a little plastic stick that you are then supposed to poke through the right hole to punch out the little chad. That's what they call it. The little square thing that's inside the perforation is called a chad, and you punch it out with your plastic stylus, which is just a stick. You pop it out, and you pull the card back out. You look at it, you can't tell if that's a vote for George Bush or who it's a vote for, right? Because it doesn't have words on it, right? The words are on this thing, right? Which is stationary at the voting station, right? You slide your card under there so that the chads are lined up with these holes. And if I'm trying to vote for John Hagelin, the Natural Law Party candidate for president, I'm punching through here and punching out the right chad. If the card is properly inserted, right, all the way, right, you follow the directions and get it inserted all the way so that they're lined up properly. That's one problem. Another problem is it turns out you punch out those little square things, and by 2 p.m., like there's a big pile of that little square paper trash, like the tiny little squares that you're punching out of your card. There's a pile of them in the machine underneath the hole that you're trying to punch through. So you pop it with a plastic stick, and it like indents, but it doesn't punch off all the way because there's a pile of paper trash underneath it, right? There's not a little hole, there's not an indentation underneath it anymore because it's filled up with the little chads that previous voters have punched off. That was happening in multiple Florida counties. In addition, in this particular county, because they had 13 presidential candidates on the ballot, and they were trying to figure out how to make it fit. The presidential ballot looked different in every county in Florida, right? They're drawn by county election officials. They each had their own ballot design. This one, they said, instead of listing all the names down the left, which is how most counties did it, and they managed to make it fit, they said, oh, we're going to make this fit better. We're going to list the names on both sides. What's the problem with that?
It's not intuitive when you're punching.
Yeah, what are you going to do wrong?
Hit hole number 2 for the Democratic candidate.
Palm Beach County, one particular precinct in Palm Beach County, which consists mostly of elderly retired Jews from New York, Pat Buchanan got 9,000 votes. Pat Buchanan, among the things he was well known for, was controversial anti-Semitic statements. There are no retired Jews in Palm Beach County who are voting for Pat Buchanan. I mean, I'm going to say none, right? Literally none, right? 9,000 votes for Pat Buchanan. There is no other precinct anywhere in Florida where he got anywhere remotely that many numbers of votes. And immediately after the election, like on that same night, people were looking at the vote totals coming in and being like, what the heck is going on? And somebody looked at the ballot and they started knocking on doors and finding voters who are, they're like, who'd you vote for? I voted for Al Gore. They're like, could you tell us, describe the ballot, what'd you look like, what it looked like, and which hole did you push? And he's like, oh, if I remember right, he was number 2 and I pushed that second hole. That second hole is for Pat Buchanan, right? Because it's just designed in a confusing way. You're looking down the left, oh, second guy, I'm punching the second hole. Right? Multiple people, partly through their own mistake, right, are casting a ballot for the wrong person. Multiple people in Florida, I mean thousands of people in Florida, are casting a ballot for which no vote is counted because they don't successfully get that Chad all the way punched out of the card. Right? Thousands upon thousands of votes were turned in on Election Day in Florida, and the machine that counted the cards reported no vote cast for president on this ballot. Thousands of them. This became an issue because George W. Bush, at the end of election night, was ahead of Al Gore by 537 votes in Florida.
So they didn't like how when you walked up to hand in your ballot, like you couldn't line it up to that before officially handing it in. So you would only ever see the dots unless you're actually when you're in the booth.
I'm not sure. So
after the hole is punched.
After you punch it, you pull the card back out.
Yeah, and then from there you never see the names again, so you don't know where the dots would go.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, if you looked at it and if you read all the fine print instructions, that's what I'm looking for, it would say, make sure the chads are fully perforated and fully detached. And so if you looked at it and you're like, oh, look, that one's kind of indented, but it didn't come off, you could slide it back in and you could jam it harder and try again, and you'd be like, then you could go ask somebody, look, I can't get this thing to come off because there's all this trash, somebody needs to clean out this machine. You could do all that. But then if you don't do all that, if you just think you voted for everybody, you punch it out, then you just go slide it into a machine. And the way the machine counts were set up is it wouldn't spit out your ballot. It would say, because it is possible, right? Some people, this was not the only race that was on the ballot, right? There was a race for senator, and there were races for Congress and other stuff. There were some ballot propositions, so there were multiple different pages of ballots. You would have to flip the page over and then slide a new card in, or however it works, or sift your card over or something. And it's not uncommon for people to vote for some things and leave other things blank, right? So you might vote for George W. Bush, but then not really have any opinion about the congressional race because you don't know who those people are, and you would leave that blank. It is quite unusual for somebody to skip the top race on the ballot. I got no opinion about George Bush versus Al Gore, but I really want to vote for this guy for Congress. I'm going to do that. Not that many people do that in most elections. And so the machine doesn't spit it out because it was recording some votes for some things, somebody voted for something and they skipped some other things. But thousands upon thousands of people skipped the presidential line and voted for like state legislature. It just didn't make any sense to election experts, right? It seemed like there was some significant counting defect happening, right? So this is a wholly separate and additional question, right? How are legislatures allowed to draw the lines, right, for the districts in which we're going to hold elections? And here's a different question. How are state and county elections officials allowed, what kind of voting technology are they allowed to adopt? Are there decisions that they might make about the adoption of particular voting technology that could violate the Constitution? Or once we have a particular voting technology in place, are there failures that could happen on election day in terms of how accurately and fairly and effectively the votes are counted that might violate the Constitution? Let me show you one more image, maybe two more images, and then we'll talk about how lawyers and judges try to figure some of these questions out. So a couple years after Bush versus Gore, there was a recall election in California. So Gray Davis was the Democratic governor of California. And there had been a major energy crisis in California. Enron went bankrupt, and it like derailed all of California's like electricity grid. There was some whole chaotic crisis that may or may not have been Governor Gray Davis's fault in any way, but his role became politically controversial. And California Constitution has a provision that says you can recall elected office holders. That is, you don't have to wait till their term is over. You can submit petitions, get enough signatures. There's a lot of signatures in California you got to get. But if you get enough signatures, it forces an early election. And the way the California recall provision was written, it said if you submit enough signatures, there will be an early election that will be scheduled by the State Secretary of State, on which there will be two questions. The first question is, should Governor Gray Davis be recalled from office, yes or no? Second question is, if he is recalled from office, who should replace him? Right. So at the same time, you're going to vote, should we kick him out of the governorship, and who's going to be the next governor, right? And if the first one is no, if 50% plus one people vote no on the first one, then it doesn't matter, the next one. But if more than 50% of the people vote him out, then we need to know who the next governor is. And the procedures for getting on the ballot for this special, unusual recall election were way easier than the normal procedures for getting on the ballot for a regular election. And so the gubernatorial ballot in this recall election looked like that. I think there were like 106 candidates or something like that for governor. Arnold Schwarzenegger won. He was the one who won the election. But right up here it says, do you think Gray Davis should be recalled, yes or no? And then these are, I know you can't read any of these words, it doesn't matter. Arnold Schwarzenegger's on there somewhere. These are all of the candidates for governor. Multiple counties in California use punch card voting technology with this ballot. Right? The Secretary of State, this is after Bush versus Gore, right? After the 2000 election controversy, the Secretary of State, who's in charge of elections in California, had already said, after the Florida 2000 controversy, he had issued an official statement saying, those punch cards don't work, we need to get rid of them, they are constitutionally illegitimate, they don't effectively count the votes, we are passing new state laws, and Congress is passing new law, there's going to be new state and federal money to phase them out, get new voting technology. They had already said that as a matter of official state policy. By the next state election in California, we're going to have different technology in place in every county. But the recall election wasn't planned, right? It happened sooner than anybody was anticipating, right? Because the next scheduled election was supposed to be like 2 years later, and they hadn't replaced any of them. And they're like, all right, I know we said it's unconstitutional, but that's all we got. So you got to vote on this ballot, on these punch card machines, in some counties, but not others. Right? All right. And then this last thing I'll show you is just the 2000 election map. So So that's the map. Blue is Republican here. You can see how close it was. You can see, for example, that Al Gore won the popular vote by about 500,000 votes. And you can see that George Bush narrowly won the electoral vote. You need 270 electoral votes to win. George W. Bush got 271. On election night, nobody had 270. Al Gore had 266. George Bush had like 250, somewhere around there. And Florida had not been called. Right? It was a perfect storm, like disaster election. Right? Super close. Nationwide, right? Gore won the popular vote, but that's very close, right? 100 million votes, and he won by like 500,000. George W. Bush is ahead. Florida's votes are going to be decisive, and George W. Bush is ahead by 537 votes on election night. The networks had, at various points in election night, the national news networks had wrongly called the election twice. They had called it for George W. Bush, and then they had withdrawn that, and then some of them, if I'm remembering right, had switched it and called it for Gore, and then they withdrew that, and then they said, we don't know who won. The race is too close to call. Right. So I want us to think about what the Supreme Court did in response to the November 2000 election. Maybe also what the Supreme Court should have done, if that's different, if you have a different answer for that. And then based on what the court did or should have done in Bush versus Gore, what are the implications of that for other questions about constitutional disputes regarding election law that come up? Because we still have a lot of them. This one was controversial and it's now 20 years old or whatever. And presumably whatever the court did here should have some implications for what the court should do on other related questions. I think that's all my images. Questions so far? So, Florida election law says this, right? So, again, a couple weird things about U.S. elections, right? State legislatures draw the districts for federal elections. I don't think there's any country in the world that does it that way. It's a little weird. Like, why would it be the state government that, maybe for the state elections, but why are they drawing districts for federal elections? Likewise, the relationship between states and counties is sort of weird. Right? We're having a statewide election for governor, and we're having a federal election for president, and each county in Florida adopts its own voting technology, which, if you think about that for a minute, it will occur to you that counties that have more resources will more often update their voting technology than counties that have fewer resources. And so in Florida, it turned out, immediately following the election, there was lots of disputes about whether the votes were being counted accurately, and there were some counties with thousands and thousands and thousands of disputed votes because they were using really outdated technology, and there were other counties with much fewer disputed votes because they were using newer technology that more effectively counted votes. The best voting technology is what we currently use here in New York, which is a paper ballot that you fill out with a pen. It does not have to be high-tech. It just has to be clear instructions that are easily counted by a machine, but then easily recounted, if necessary, by humans. There is also computerized voting, which is easily counted by a machine, but not easily recounted by humans, if necessary, because there's no paper trail. There's no actual physical record of the voter's ballot. And then there's the punch card technology, which is not easily counted by anybody, human or machine.
Is that a safeguard against corruption to have the state legislatures and counties do their own elections, and then pass the information along to the federal government?
I don't think it was designed in that way. That is a potential benefit, although I think it cuts both directions. Right? So some people have argued that one advantage of our decentralized system is, for example, that it would make it harder to hack a federal election for president, right? Because there's no one national source of votes, right? You would have to hack all the different states. On the other hand, as we see in the ongoing investigation of our recent presidential election, there's substantial evidence that Russian hackers infiltrated the election systems of multiple states. And you might conclude that a federal election agency with the power and resources to run federal elections would be more likely to set up effective security technology than having each individual state do it on their own. So it kind of cuts either direction. It might help, or it might make things worse. It might make it harder for the people trying to infiltrate and influence the elections or buy somebody off, right? You could buy off an election official in Florida, but that wouldn't necessarily shape the whole national election. Or you could buy off an election official in a particular county, but that wouldn't necessarily shape the whole state election. Florida election law says this. It says that if the election is really close for any office, right, mayor, state legislature, governor, president, senator, whatever, any office, if the election is really close within some certain percentage, right, the margin between the two candidates is within 0.5% or whatever it said. If the election's really close, then there should be an automatic an automatic recount, statewide recount of the machine tallies, which doesn't mean an individual recount of individual ballots. It just means every precinct is going to double check that the numbers that were spit out by their machines at the end of the night were accurately reported to the state. And we're going to double check all the math, right? So that's automatic. And then it said that, again, if it's a really close election, it was up to the individual candidates, presumably the candidate who is currently losing, individual candidates to request recounts of actual ballots, right? That did not happen automatically, but the law said that the candidates could request it, right? If it's within 0.5% margin, the losing candidate can request a hand recount of individual ballots. And then it laid out some procedures for how that would work. It said, for example, which officials in each local jurisdiction would be in charge of it. It's basically local elections officials and judges would form like panels that would be in charge of these hand recounts if a candidate requested them. And it said that the standard, if you're going to conduct a hand recount, the standard is if you can determine the intent of the voter, then the vote should be counted. That's what it said in Florida election law. And many states had similar laws with similar phrasing, right? If the intent of the voter is clear on the ballot, right, and yet the machine counted it some other way, right, then that vote should be changed, right? If the people, the humans looking at the ballot can determine the intent of the voter, that's the standard.
Is this just a Florida law?
I mean, it's Florida law that's relevant in this case, although many of the provisions of this law were similar in most other states. In the Supreme Court opinion, they referenced, I think it was 30-some states had language about determining the intent of the voter as a specific standard if recounts were necessary. So, for example, in the punch card counties, right, if there was evidence that the voter had stabbed Chad, right, it was clearly somebody had attempted to knock off this little square perforated thing, but it was still hanging on by one corner or two corners, right? It was partly detached but not fully detached. Seems like the intent of the voter is clear, right? Somebody clearly tried to knock that thing off and failed to get it fully removed. What if the little Chad was dimpled, but all four corners were still connected? Is the intent of the voter clear there? There was some disputes about that, right? If it's hanging off by one or two corners, seems like the intent of the voter is clear. Somebody started to push it and then maybe changed their mind, right? Maybe not so clear, I don't know. That's one of the disputes that came up. In other counties where they used different technology, there were other kinds of disputes, like, right, so some counties used the paper ballots like we use here, where they give you a pen, and somebody would fill in the box for George W. Bush, and then also fill in the write-in box and write George W. Bush, like in the blank. It's like they were just confused, maybe. Like, there's this blank here, maybe I'm supposed to write the guy's name in here, right? And the machine wouldn't count it, because it's like you cast 2 different votes for president. But if both votes are for the same person, then I'm pretty sure the intent of the voter is clear, and so we should count it. There were other ones where somebody, again, these people are not fully following the directions, right? It's like if you don't do good on the SATs because you didn't fill in the bubbles right, that's partly your fault, right? Somebody would fill in the bubble for George W. Bush and then cross it out with a big X and then fill in the bubble for Al Gore, something like that, right? There were ballots like that. Or ballots where somebody had made a mark in the circle, but they hadn't fully filled in the bubble, but it was a clear mark. They had made like a check mark in the circle instead of filling in the bubble, and the machine didn't count it, but the intent of the voter was clear, right? So the Gore campaign is behind by 500 votes, and they request a hand recount of individual ballots in certain counties, right? They did not initially request a statewide recount because it seemed, based on the evidence as it was coming out, it seemed like there were certain counties that had particular problems, right? Counties with large populations, with problematic voting technology, where the election night totals were saying, like 100,000 people voted, but there's only 84,000 votes for president were recorded by the machines, like something is weird, and so they would request a hand recount in those counties. And the Bush campaign went to court. George W. Bush lawyered up, and the campaign went to court. And they argued, first in state court, and then in federal court, that the recounts should be stopped. In state court, the arguments are complicated. There was a million different legal arguments, a whole bunch of different cases, all filed over a matter of days and weeks. But the basic argument in the state cases, in state court, was that the recount procedures that were underway were not sticking to the letter of state law, right? What the Florida election law said about how the recount was supposed to work, they weren't following that exactly right. The Bush campaign lost that lawsuit unanimously, I believe, in the state Supreme Court, Florida Supreme Court. And then they filed a federal constitutional lawsuit. They filed an emergency petition for an immediate hearing in a local federal district court and quickly appealed to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals and quickly appealed that to the U.S. Supreme Court. And when these federal suits were filed, initially, commentators were all over TV, including Republicans, right, saying, well, that's not going to go anywhere. The state case, there might be some issues there. They might have a chance on that one. But the federal case is not going to go anywhere because under our constitutional system, election law is basically a matter of state control, right? So the issues, if there are issues, are state law issues, which the Florida Supreme Court gets to decide. That one, we'll see how it goes. The federal one is not going to go anywhere, right? And the federal district judge that first heard the case quickly dismissed it. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals panel that heard the case, which included both Democratic and Republican judges, quickly dismissed it, right? There are no federal constitutional issues here. It's up to the states. It has always been up to the states to figure out what kind of ballot technology to use, how to count them, what the recount procedures are. The state and county election board officials are following Florida election law. The state courts in Florida are looking over their shoulder to make sure they're following it right. There's no federal constitutional issue here for the federal courts to weigh in on. That is what did every single person say that? I'm sure not, right? But I remember, I had the TV on a lot, and I remember there were lawyers on both sides of the political spectrum saying that over and over again. There's just no federal issue here. And the Supreme Court agrees to hear the case, which was surprising to many people in and of itself. And the Supreme Court quickly decides the case. And the Supreme Court rules 5-4 that the recounts should stop, which effectively decides the outcome of the presidential election. And they made 2 constitutional arguments in support of that judgment. It's 2 different opinions. The court decided this case really fast. They were rushing to get these opinions done because their impression was that if finishes, or even gets along far enough to where Al Gore is now in the lead, which some people thought it might be heading that way, then it was going to be harder to stop it at that point, right? So the court was clearly rushing, and they could not agree. It's a 5-4 decision, but the 5 justices in the majority could not agree on a single argument to support the decision. So they published 2 different opinions, which made 2 different constitutional arguments, each of which were joined by some of the 5 conservative justices. There was nothing that they could all agree on. And the first argument was about Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, which is not a famous one. Article 2 is about the presidency. Section 1 has a long passage about the Electoral College and how it's going to work. And Article 2, Section 1, Paragraph 2, says this. This is about the Electoral College. Each state shall appoint, in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct, a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. Each state may appoint, in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct, a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. What's that sentence about? What does it say? Each state may appoint, in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct, a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. Yeah.
That's the Electoral College, right?
Yeah. And what's the gist of that sentence?
Just that the state has the authority to appoint who represents the votes of the people.
Yeah. That's half of it. What else is in there? Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives. Yeah.
So the number of electoral college votes is how many senators and representatives combined.
That's the basic point of the sentence. It's just telling you how many votes you get in the Electoral College, right? Which was a compromise at the Constitutional Convention, right? Because every state gets 2 senators, remember, so that overweights small states, right? And the number of representatives is apportioned according to population. So some people were like, well, the presidency should be elected according to population, and then some people in the small states were like, no, nobody's going to listen to us. So the compromise is we'll add up your number of representatives and then add 2 to everybody's. Everybody's got 2 senators. We'll add 2 to everybody's. And so that gives a little bit of a boost to the small states who don't have very many representatives. That is the main gist of that sentence. The only other thing it says, really, is this, that each state shall appoint these electors in the manner that the legislature of the state directs, which was, again, a compromise. The framers, you might recall from Common Law 1, the framers did not require that there actually be elections for president. And in the beginning, most states did not have elections for president. In most states at the beginning, the legislature just appointed the electors. Oh, our state gets 12 votes in the Electoral College. All right, we got Thomas Jefferson running against John Adams. We got a Federalist majority in our state legislature here in Massachusetts. John Adams is from Massachusetts. Obviously, we're voting for him. We are just going to appoint, the legislature is going to appoint 12 people to the Electoral College whom we know to be Adams-supporting Federalists. That's how it worked at the beginning. But the wording was written so as to allow the legislature, if and when it chose, to schedule an election instead. Oh, yeah, all right, okay. People are complaining about the legislature just appointing these guys. Starting next time, starting in 1804, we'll have an election. And then whoever gets the most votes from the people, that's who we'll appoint as our electors. Right? So that's what it says. Yeah.
don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but is the point of the Article 2 argument that the number of votes the people had doesn't matter because of the electorate?
So one thing that the Bush administration lawyers argued at the time, not Bush, there's no Bush administration, the Bush campaign lawyers argued at the time, was that it's totally up to the legislature to decide who our electors are. And so even if we lose this recount, we lose all the legal challenges and we lose the recount, there was a Republican-controlled legislature in Tallahassee. The governor of Florida was Jeb Bush, George W. Bush's brother, and they were making plans to have the legislature just appoint a different slate of electors. Right? Even if the Florida courts certified a Gore slate, they were making plans, but that was like a backup plan. Right? They didn't want to resort to that. Their argument in the Supreme Court, based on this same sentence, was slightly different. It was an argument that nobody had ever made before. It had never occurred to any. I mean, maybe there have been some previously closed presidential elections. There was the disputed one in 1876, which was also partly about Florida's votes. That's similar in many ways, but there have not been that many disputed presidential vote counts. But for sure, nobody could find any evidence of anybody having made this argument before. Here's what they say. They say, because it says that each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct the following number of electors, the Florida courts have no role, no constitutional role, to play in determining who won the election. Only the Florida legislature gets to decide the rules of who won the election. Because of that, those 3-4 words there, in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct, however many words that is. Right? That's what they argued. What do you think of that argument? I mean, I've already said what I think of it, I guess, but what do you think of it?
Weren't the recount rules or provisions in place set up by the legislature?
Yes! Right? That whole thing about the intent of the voter, that's in the legislature's law. That is in the Florida election laws that the legislature set up. Right? They are the ones who said that the courts and the county election boards play a role in the recounts. Right? It's not like the courts making it up. Like the courts were trying to usurp. There was some allegations, right? So Florida's governor was Jeb Bush, and Florida's legislature was controlled by Republicans, but Florida's Supreme Court still had a Democratic majority from the previous Democratic governor's appointments. And there were some allegations made that the Florida Supreme Court was trying to throw its weight behind Al Gore and trying to support his effort to win the election by changing the rules. But there's not really any evidence that they tried to change the rule. Right? I mean, the law says if the election's this close and any candidate requests it, you got to do a hand recount of the individual ballots, and the standard for the hand recount is determining the intent of the voter. If you look at a ballot and you can't determine the intent of the voter, then you throw that one out. But if you can, that is in the law enacted by the legislature, and that's what Florida's courts and election officials were in the middle of trying to do. And it does not really seem to make that much sense to say that only the state's legislature is allowed to be involved in. I don't even know how that would work. Anytime the state legislature enacts a law and then some dispute later emerges about what that law means or requires, I'm pretty sure the state's courts are always going to be involved in that, settling that dispute. How is just the legislature going to handle that completely by itself? Right? That's one argument.
I think that problem stems from the founders and framers not being able to think of a world where we all have the ability to, vote individually by the millions, these ballots, and it's a much more complicated process that we have now that would be forecasted. And so because of that, I think that they should give some leniency to the text of the Constitution. I'm sure it might say that only the legislature is involved, but we should be able to expand that to allow the legislature to add additional, aspects to voting beyond just an electoral college.
That's certainly what Gore's lawyers said, right? And right, right. The point, what we know from the evidence, if we're trying to go back to the framers' views, what we know is that the main point of that provision was to say how many electors everybody gets, and to say that it is up to the legislature whether to hold an election or not. Right? That's why they put that phrase in there. The legislature can pass a law that provides for presidential elections, or it can pass a law that provides for appointment by state legislatures. Either one. It's their call. But there's no evidence that they thought it meant, even without knowledge of 21st century vote counting problems, there's no evidence that they thought it meant that the legislature could not, as it always does when it passes laws, could not make some provisions for courts or administrative agencies or whoever else to be involved in the enforcement and interpretation of that law, right? So that's one of the arguments that persuades 3 of the court's justices. Rehnquist, Scalia, and Thomas endorsed that argument. Justice O'Connor and Kennedy are not persuaded by that argument, but there's a different argument that the Bush campaign's lawyers made, and it's based on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So 2 different arguments. Article 2, Section 1, Equal Protection Clause. The Equal Protection Clause argument goes like this. The Florida Supreme Court ordered the manual, after the Gore campaign requested it, and it made its way up to the Supreme Court. The Florida Supreme Court ordered a manual recount of hand recount of the ballots, seeking to determine the intent of the voter. This recount violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment because it will lead to similar ballots being treated differently in different parts of the state. The recount, as ordered by the state Supreme Court, which the instructions which they gave said, elections officials in each local jurisdiction are supposed to do a hand recount, follow these procedures, attempt to determine the intent of the voter, as it says in the statute. Those procedures are not precise enough to ensure that similar ballots are treated similarly. Right? What if the elections officials and judges in one county said that little Chad hanging off by 2 corners was clear indication of the intent of the voter, and the elections officials and judges in a different county said that the same basic kind of ballot did not have clear indication of the intent of the voter? That would be a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, and hence the recount should stop. What do you think of that argument? Yep.
Seems like a more persuasive argument because there is no standard for what they meant by voter's intent.
Better? Yeah. Other thoughts? Directing a hand recount using the standard of the intent of the voter violates the Equal Protection Clause because similar ballots might be treated differently in different parts of the state. Yeah.
Based on that concept, the ballots in the beginning violate the Equal Protection Clause because if they're going to be, judged differently on this side because they're different, when the ballots were cast, they were different. And, if that's your argument, it doesn't go all the way through.
That's a good point, too.
So the Equal Protection Clause is originally written for racial discrimination, and people hold that to the highest scrutiny. But I don't find that there's a lot of discrimination taking place if your vote was attempted to be read, and they just happened because of the local county laws to not cast your vote. I don't find that like a very egregious violation of somebody's equality, especially because it's on political grounds and not based on some other important factor like race.
Right. The Bush campaign's lawyers did not make any allegation that that elections officials were systematically undercounting the ballots from particular groups based on race or any other kind of criteria like that. There was no if anything, that argument would cut the other direction. But no, they weren't making that argument for sure. So that on some accounts of the Equal Protection Clause, that would weaken the argument for sure. Other reactions? This argument is a million times better than the other one, right? I mean, this one, it's, I don't know. There are different views on every Supreme Court decision that we're going to read and discuss. This is just my view. Not everybody agrees with it. But, that is, the worst caricature of lawyers, can make up an argument for anything. They are trying to figure out some possible way to get to this result, and they sent all their law clerks and whatever off to the law books, read every sentence in the Constitution that you can, and come back with something that we can use because we got nothing, right? That is what they came up with. That is not a good constitutional argument, right? That is not what that sentence means in the Constitution. This argument is way better. It is potentially, if you have a really narrow vision of the 14th Amendment where it really only applies to race, which was its original purpose, then this would not work. But if you have a broader vision of the 14th Amendment, and you're thinking about cases like the reapportionment cases from the 1960s, one person, one vote, right? Where the court says you got one district with 10,000 people and another district next to it with 100,000 people, and they both get the same number of representatives, that violates the Equal Protection Clause. If you're thinking about it in those terms, then it is potentially problematic to have similar votes treated differently in the counting process. But the problem here, there's two problems here, and one of them is the one Maurice identified. That is a potentially good argument, but it is misdirected here because remember, Florida is the one who set up an election system where every county adopts its own technology, and the poor counties are using technologies that have 10% error rates. I'm not making that up, right? The punch card ballots, nobody paid that much attention to it before, but literally 10% of the voters, once people were looking at it, were not having some of their votes counted accurately, right? Neighboring counties with more resources had paper ballots or computer ballots with error rates of 1%, right? That is the discrimination there, right? Is that votes are being more effectively counted in some counties than others, and the recount that is ongoing is an effort to reduce that discrimination, right? If there's some counties that got 10% of ballots that were not properly counted, and if in half of those we can figure out what the intent of the voter is, then that is reducing the disparity in treatment of different voters. Right? The recount is not the problem. Right? The recount is trying to accurately count as many possible votes as we can. We're not going to get all of them, but more would be better. Right? And it would reduce the disparity in the treatment of votes across different parts of the states. The second problem with this argument, and the dissenting justices pointed this one out too, is, okay, suppose we agree with you, and two of the dissenting judges said, all right, I'll go along with it this far. I agree. Based on decisions like our one-person, one-vote decisions, the Equal Protection Clause applies to situations like this. It would be a potential violation of the Constitution if somebody actually showed us that the state was treating similar ballots differently, right? Counting some of them and not counting others. That would be a potential violation of the Constitution. And the remedy for it would be for us to state a clear standard that should be used and then tell them to keep going with the recount. But here, apply this clear standard to all of the ballots. That would be the fix for a real equal protection violation. Not stop the recount and just let's throw up our hands and say, well, there's 10,000 people, we don't know who they really meant to vote for, but this guy won by 500 votes. Like what? That is not the remedy. How is that the remedy of the equal protection violation? Halt the recount. Right? So here's one way to think about Bush versus Gore. Right? There are some justices on the Supreme Court who believe the court should play a very active role in sort of policing the fairness of our democratic process, right? The one-person, one-vote decisions and the like. There are other justices on the Supreme Court who don't think the court should play that role. Remember, Justice Frankfurter wrote a famous 50-page dissenting opinion in Baker versus Carr, and then he had a stroke the next day, right? He really, really, really did not like that decision. Courts should not get involved in this. It's blatantly partisan. No way should we get involved in that, right? Two opposing views. The thing about Bush versus Gore is that the justices who intervened in the electoral process are the ones who previously had always been saying the court should not get involved in questions like this. So that is going to raise some suspicions, right? Well, what? Wait a minute. Felon disenfranchisement? You said that was okay, right? Unequal size voting districts? You said that was okay, right? Partisan gerrymandering? You said that was okay. Voter ID laws? You said that was okay. But now you're intervening, right? It raises a suspicion that they are doing it not because of the legal arguments, but because they want one particular dude to win, right? And that suspicion is amplified by the fact that one of the arguments they came up with seems transparently made up, just for this case, right? The other argument they came up with is a way better argument that has many potential benefits for judicial supervision of our elections. Much better argument. But not only does it not really fit this case the way they are fitting it to this case, they also said, and this is maybe the most notorious line in the opinion, they said, our consideration is limited to the present circumstances, for the problem of equal protection in election processes generally presents many complexities. They made their equal protection argument, and they said our consideration is limited to the present circumstances, for the problem of equal protection in election processes generally presents many complexities. The way most people read that sentence is to say, we don't really mean this, right? This is the equal protection argument, this is the constitutional argument we are applying today, but it does not apply tomorrow. Our consideration of the equal protection clause is limited to the present circumstances? The court never says that. The whole way the Supreme Court operates is it decides the case before it on the basis of some reading of the Constitution. It spells out a constitutional argument, which then applies to every future case that is similar until the court changes its mind. Right? That is the doctrine of precedent. That is how the court always operates. And the Supreme Court appeared to be saying, do not cite this case as precedent. And the Supreme Court, a majority of the Supreme Court, has never, since December 2000, cited Bush versus Gore as a precedent. They just didn't mean it. They meant it for that case, but they did not mean it as a principle of constitutional equality that applies to our elections going forward.
Did they say that for both sides, for the article section 1 as well? Or?
I think it was just it was two separate opinions, and it was just in this one. So I guess that one maybe still applies, although that one did not have majority support, right? So if I'm remembering this right, so 3 justices only joined that opinion. 5 justices officially joined this opinion because they wanted there to be an official opinion of the court, right? So this one is technically a precedent, except it's got a sentence in it that says don't treat this one as a precedent, right? So yeah, that's weird. The reason I showed you that election ballot from California is because it's a good example of the subsequent impact of Bush versus Gore on election law disputes. A bunch of voting rights people went to court in California, and they said, you got to be kidding me, this ballot cannot possibly be constitutional. Under Bush versus Gore, I guarantee you that there's going to be different votes, different ballots treated differently in different parts of the state. If where some of our counties, we got 106 candidates on the ballot, and some of our counties are using punch cards, and some of them have more effective technologies, no way that that's consistent with equal protection holding in Bush versus Gore. And an initial federal court decision ruled in their favor. They said, indeed, citing Bush versus Gore as precedent, this ballot violates the Equal Protection Clause. The state cannot go forward. This was before the election. The state cannot go forward with this election if some counties are using this kind of ballot. And so presumably that was going to mean the state's going to have to delay the election and figure out how to fix their voting technology in these counties. But that decision was reversed on appeal. Right? And the court that reversed it pointed to this line in Bush versus Gore, and they're like, yeah, it kind of seems like it applies, but the court told us not to do that, so I guess we're not going to apply it. Right? That is one example. There's I mentioned briefly on the handout, a case from Ohio, League of Women Voters versus Bruner. It's about vote counting in November 2004 election. So George W. Bush versus John Kerry. Bush won nationally, and he won in Ohio, but the Ohio vote was quite close, and there were some vote counting irregularities. And in fact, there was a bunch of evidence. The League of Women Voters introduced tons of evidence that Republican election officials in Ohio had intentionally taken all kinds of actions in advance of Election Day to suppress Democratic votes. The ones that I think got the most attention is there were some college towns in Ohio. So I went to Oberlin, which is a small progressive liberal arts college. There's another one not far away called Kenyon College. Students were lined up for like 9 hours to vote in those towns. In Kenyon College, they finished voting at like 4 in the morning. They're not allowed to close the polls if you're in line, right? So the precinct in Kenyon College was assigned 2 voting machines for like several thousand registered voters. One of them broke at some point during the day, so they were using one machine. This was, according to League of Women Voters, substantial evidence Republicans had done this on purpose, right, to suppress Democratic votes. Right, there were neighboring, more conservative precincts that had many more voting machines provided. And again, some of the lawyers and judges are like Bush versus Gore seems like it clearly applies, but the ultimate decision in the case by the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals was like, nope, Bush versus Gore doesn't apply to this. No equal protection problems here. One of the last major Supreme Court rulings on election law was a voter ID case in 2008. It was from Indiana, which passed a strict photo ID law to vote. In order to vote, you got to have state-issued photo identification. Voting rights advocates introduced lots of evidence that this was disproportionately going to burden people of color, the poor, students, and elderly, all of whom were less likely to have state-issued photo identification, and hence that it violated the Equal Protection Clause as interpreted and applied in cases such as Bush versus Gore and others, and they lost. Supreme Court upheld the voter ID law and did not mention Bush versus Gore. And so I got a minute or two left, just to bring it back to the gerrymandering question that the court has to decide now. It's a different particular issue, right? How do we count the votes, right, fairly, and how do we draw the districts are 2 different legal issues, but they are obviously related, and the constitutional arguments that apply to one might apply to the other. And there's basically three ways that the court could approach these kind of questions. Right? Option number one is the court has a robust vision of democracy and political equality and what's required in order to run a fair and democratic system, and we know that partisan officials are sometimes going to depart from those standards, and the court's going to step in and try to fix it. Right? Cases like the one-person, one-vote cases, right? Every state in the country is refusing to redraw its districts, despite massive population shifts over the whole course of the 20th century. The court has got to step in and fix that. Option number two is like Frankfurter's option, right? Like, don't do it, right? The court should not get involved in this. Everything having to do with election rules is so inherently partisan that we should just leave it up to the partisan officials themselves to work it out. Let them fight it out. Do not get the courts drawn into this. Right? That's Frankfurter's argument. Option number three is basically what the court's been doing for the past 20 years. They have occasionally weighed in and imposed some limits in the area of election law, but they have frequently stayed out in other cases. And if you look at the judicial voting patterns in these cases, they look a little bit dubious, right? The justices in the majority in Bush versus Gore saying, okay, yeah, we're going to weigh in here. The court's going to tell us how this presidential vote counting has to go. Those same justices say, oh yeah, Indiana can adopt whatever kind of photo ID law it wants. Does that disenfranchise thousands of people of color and students and elderly people in Indiana? We'll let the partisan officials figure that out. How are those two things consistent with each other? Right? Either there's a robust provision, a robust principle of constitutional equality that courts should enforce to impose some limits on some of the more dubious actions of our partisan officials in trying to gerrymander or rig the electoral process, or there isn't. But to use those principles selectively in cases where they think they help your guy and not use them in other cases where they seem like they help the other guy, that does not seem like a good choice on the part of the court. And this year's cases, the partisan gerrymandering cases, are the test. Right? They are the test. Right? If the court divides 5-4 and says partisan gerrymandering is fine under our Constitution, just like photo ID laws are fine, that, I think we're done. I think the evidence is clear that they did not mean this principle. If they're sticking to this principle from Bush versus Gore, that is not the right outcome. Right? There have got to be limits on the partisan gerrymandering too. We will see by June. That's all.